Foresight Forum for the month of June. Again, we're talking about sustainability, tensions, and trade-offs today. I'm joined here by my guests or our co-hosts, Brad and Matt. So my name is Mike Trupis. I'm a vice president here at Foresight Management. Background in engineering, head up a lot of our business development and thought leadership efforts. So I'm excited to be your moderator today. Brad, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
I'm Brad Van Valkenburg. I'm a senior sustainability manager here at Foresight. I lead our product team, which mainly we help our clients identify and then quantify the environmental impact of the products they're making.
Cool. Matthew Van Sweden. I'm the managing director of the building performance team. So I touch just about everything that that touches buildings. So new and existing. So long history in architecture and helping engineers decarbonize their facilities.
So this is pretty par for the course, but we got quite a nerd fest here on the Foresight Forum this month, and it's going to be a really good discussion. So let's talk about how this works. We're going to have a discussion for about 45 minutes. If you have questions, there is a functionality in Zoom at the bottom where you can put them in the Q&A or chat function. So put that down there if you have questions as we're going through, and we'll save the last 15 or so minutes to answer any questions that you may have. And then we'll also have a summary that outlines what we discussed today. We're also recording this, so if you're interested, or if you watch it and you think it's great and you want to share it with somebody later, it'll be on YouTube. So that's kind of the blocking and tackling. We always like to take just a minute to help people understand, like, who are we and why do we feel like we're credible enough to talk about tensions and trade-offs. So Foresight exists to champion energy management, accelerate sustainability, and increase profitability for our clients. I don't know, big picture, we often explain, we function as outsourced energy and sustainability managers for our clients. So many of our clients have a footprint that's not large enough to justify a full-time person doing that work. We can support them and be that for them. For our larger clients, they have energy and sustainability staff, and we function as just additional support for them. So you can think of us too as an organization that really believes in looking at things holistically. We are going to cover that a ton here in this webinar, so I don't have to spend a ton of time on this slide. But again, we believe that if you want to have success in energy and sustainability, you have to look at it holistically. And then you might be curious, well, what kind of organizations do you work with, Mike? We are predominantly focused on industrial manufacturing. We also work with a number of commercial clients as well. But we basically find the more complexity you have, the more energy you're consuming, the more carbon you're emitting if you're making something. Those are typically good criteria for us in areas that we can really help you, again, accelerate your sustainability journey. So with that, let's jump into this conversation. I think it's going to get a little bit crazy, like I mentioned, on the tensions, but maybe we should just frame up the conversation first. So I'll let Matt and Brad hop in here in a second, but I always like to think about this is like, how do we get here? I think a lot of people are acknowledging the problem, which is we look at a problem and we get overly focused on one problem, and then maybe we fix it and there's new problems that crop up. And so that's a theme I think that we're going to talk about a fair amount in this webinar. I actually like framing this up on holism versus atomism. So the concept of holism is you're looking at the whole piece, every piece of the puzzle and putting it all together. And atomism is you're looking at all those individual pieces. And a lot of people boil this down to like Eastern thought versus Western thought. And actually, I found a construct really interesting. A guy named Thomas Telhelm wrote a paper around, it's called the Rice Theory of Culture. And I find this stuff fascinating. Matt and I have nerded out on this in the past. But if you actually look at historic cultures that farmed rice based on how it has to be cultivated, it's a very communal affair. And so a lot of cultures typically have looked holistically at things when they're a rice farming culture, and typically wheat farming cultures, which are the other major grain, often end up being more individualistic. And so that's, again, the lazy way of saying Eastern versus Western. That doesn't hold perfectly true. But what's happened is when the Industrial Revolution started, I don't think it's a coincidence that started in the West, because you could argue atomism is actually really well suited to begin the Industrial Revolution. When you think about like who invented the assembly line, it was Henry Ford. Very Western idea of like, let's break everything into little parts and put them all in a line and assemble things way faster. I don't think it's, again, a coincidence that like America invented the assembly line. But I would argue now, you fast forward 120 years later, I don't think it's a coincidence that I would argue some of the best holistically manufactured vehicles are actually a lot of the legacy Japanese vehicles. So like Toyota and Honda have quite a legacy of being the most reliable vehicles. And I think that's because, again, that Eastern vision is let's look at things holistically. So we're going to cover this a bunch throughout the webinar, which is like, that's also attention, which is I think too often we're like looking at our little piece of sustainability and missing the forest through the trees. And I would just argue like what I just talked about isn't a commentary on like Western or Eastern thought being superior to the other. I would argue if we want to look at things holistically and have success, we really should borrow ideas and concepts out of both. And so I'm excited. I think we're going to talk about that a lot. And maybe Matt, I kind of got real abstract there. Like maybe let's like bring it into like a real art example.
Well, I'm not sure this is going to be any more grounded, and it's probably still abstract. But I'm glad Mike landed the plane at this like both and, because what I was going to start saying with this example of pointillism is like you need both. It's a both and. It's not an either or. We're not talking when we're a very polarized society right now, and so we like to frame things as like the right way or the wrong way. And the reality is, especially in this space, you need both perspectives. You need perspective, and you need deep disciplines and expertise in very specific things. And I brought this example in the art world up because in design school we had a lot of conversations about what is art and what is design. And I'm not going to open that can of worms today because that's a whole other.
That's a 4-hour webinar.
Yeah, maybe a hot takes or something. It's something different. But I like to think about art as expression and design as problem solving. And what I liked about the culture at Kendall, it was like it encouraged this dialogue between these disciplines to see what we could learn from each other. And I think this example of pointillism is like in this space really poignant. And what I mean by this is like pointillism in a structure is really just 3 or 4 colors, dots on a canvas that are thoughtfully kind of placed in proximity to each other with white space. And you can't compose a picture by just focusing on the dots. You have to like have a vision for what the picture is, what the story is, what the message wants to be. And then you kind of like get really in the detail, you get really fine. But you can't stay there. You have to back up to see is what your the dots you're putting on the canvas, are they conveying the composition or the message or the story or the visual that you want? And so it's this constant back and forth. It's this constant like, let's focus on the details. Let's focus on the sustainability strategy or the decarbonization opportunity. But then you got to step back. Is it in line with the total vision, the total composition? And it's like this leaning in, stepping back, and it's this constant thing. And also from a perspective standpoint, if you stand too far back, you won't appreciate all the work that went into it. You just see your mind blurs everything together into a cohesive picture. But if you get really fine in there, you can't see. All you see is these tiny dots that honestly aren't that attractive because they're just like these simple colors that are dots on the canvas, right? And so it works because it's both.
I love it.
And you need both. That's kind of the vision of this whole forum.
I love it. And so I think the next graphic is probably the one, if we can go to the next slide, I think the one that like Matt, when we were prepping for this webinar, brought this up and we made our own graphic around it. But it's like, once you see something like this, you can't unsee it. And so we call this the carbon tunnel vision. So we talk about sustainability. And I would always argue that the simplest definition, in my opinion, is leaving something better than you found it. And again, that isn't just a carbon discussion. And so I don't know, Matt or Brad, if you want to like unpack this a little bit. I think we've covered the in and out piece, but like there's a lot more to sustainability than just carbon emissions.
Yeah. And again, it's this both and, right? And we say oftentimes ad nauseum sometimes, you can't manage what you don't measure.
Let's go.
See, I don't say it enough, apparently. So measurement is really important. And carbon has been, from an industry perspective, the rallying sort of metric that we translate everything into, so we can kind of like, hey, are we on track? Yes or no? It's a really kind of good metric to gauge, are we making progress or not? But it's not the whole story. It's a dot. It's a dot on a canvas.
Yeah.
And if you focus only on carbon, you're missing out on a whole bunch of other stuff. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but there's lots of other things that are in tension with just focusing on low carbon, right? And human health and well-being is a kind of common denominator in a lot of my conversations. Equity is another one, right?
Yeah.
If you focus on one thing, you have a trade-off by
Yes.
less of a focus on the other. And part of the work is, and part of the expertise that you need, the discipline you need, is to hold both those truths. Like you have a goal on human health and well-being and carbon reductions, those can work simultaneously, but you need to be thoughtful and have foresight to be able to like, not us as a company, but yeah,
I think you did there. No, I
future.
like what you did there.
Like whatever the thing is, yeah, you need both, and you need expertise that can help you kind of have that vision, but also dive really deep into the carbon story. And so like that's the vision, or like the point of this graphic.
I love it. So now that we framed up like how we're thinking about this, we wanted to take some real world examples of like actual clients, discussions we've had with our clients. And so we're going to cover an example in the product world, we're going to cover an example in the building world, and we're going to cover an example in the energy world. And really, instead of just talking big picture about holism versus atomism or pointism, we're actually going to like get into the trenches here and talk about like real trade-offs that our clients have worked through. So the first one is product. And I think Brad, heading up our product group, has really good expertise here. So if an organization is looking to manufacture a new product or design that product and take it through manufacturing, what are some of the sustainability considerations and trade-offs that they may run into when designing that product?
Yeah, so the first thing you need to basically choose is what is important to our company, right?
Yeah, great.
And where we're at now, as we saw from that tunnel vision, carbon is the easiest choice to make right now. Everyone's asking about it. So what can you do to lower that carbon is where we're going to start here. And most of the time, at least 70% of the carbon in your product happens upstream from your facility before it even gets to your first gate.
Those raw materials that are
coming in. Okay. And one of the best ways to reduce the impact of those materials is to start sourcing recycled content from them, right?
Yeah.
It's great. I reached out to my procurement team. We found suppliers who are going to give me aluminum that's 90% recycled content versus the 30 I had before. I just made a huge reduction in the embodied carbon of the aluminum coming into my product, which is great. Throw a new carbon number on my product, ship it out, it all looks better. Except that's great for you in your story, but you basically just lowered the carbon that goes into your product and didn't think about the larger picture of the sourcing of all these materials, right? You're focusing on the demand side of this recycled content, and in a way you're taking your toys out of the sandbox and walking home and leaving all the other kids there with nothing else to play with. Right? Because you designed it focusing on just the carbon.
Sure.
The other piece is when we talk recycled content, a lot of people think circularity, right?
Okay.
But you can't have circularity without design in there, right?
So just because an intrinsic,
right, you're starting on one half of the circle and you're only going so far and you're done.
Got it.
Right? If you're not designing your products to be easily disassemblable and recyclable, right? You're never going to, close that circle back. You're not going to contribute to the supply side of that recycled content. You're only going to keep taking from the demand side.
So you're saying like if I spec recycled aluminum, but then I somehow like melt plastic onto it so that at the end of life, you can't easily separate it. You've effectively stopped the circle.
Yes.
Yeah, great. I sourced it, but I also torpedoed the whole approach because now at the end of life, we can't disassemble. Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly that.
Fascinating.
Yep.
Okay.
And another trade-off we see with the recycled content, and kind of where Matt was alluding to, is that carbon's great on the environmental side, but what about the health and safety or the well-being of the people using your product, right?
Great.
Another thing we're seeing a lot in the product world is people wanting to know what is in their products, what chemicals are.
Right.
We've all heard about PFAS and everything that's been happening in the past couple of years with all the different states, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't just stop there. People just want to have a full list of the chemical ingredients that make up that product. And when you start sourcing more recycled content, those two can kind of start being butting heads with each other, because unless you have full visibility through that supply chain to see where is that material being sourced from, that recycled material, you have no way to fully know what's going into your product.
Yeah.
Which is why, if that is something that's more important to you, that knowing what's in it, then maybe you should focus less on the carbon story and more on sourcing through a clean supply chain that the chemicals going into.
And we're hearing that too. You're getting at like post-consumer versus post-industrial. So often, to your point, like post-industrial, you can get more visibility. Post-consumer, certainly, like that's where we're like, we need to build a marketplace, but like, who knows what got sorted correctly?
Who knows where this? If you have a bin of polypropylene regrind that came from the municipality, that could come from 1,000 different sources with 1,000 different additives, colorants. You're not gonna know what goes into
It
that.
gets messy fast.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think like that's to kind of land where the product thing is because carbon's not the only answer, health and safety is the only answer. There are a ton of different environmental pieces, like environmental impacts that we can look at on your product.
Yeah.
And really, when you're setting it up and you're reaching out to design a new product, that's what you need to do is have what we call design for environment system, where you're going to have a list and you're going to have stakeholders from your company and you're going to walk through, okay, water usage, energy usage, recycled content, embodied carbon, material chemistry.
Good.
And you need to just decide what is important to you and to your stakeholders and your customers.
I love that. That's awesome, Brad. And we're going to touch on some of those ideas later too. So that's fantastic. Thanks. So Matt, let's change gears and talk about buildings. So there's obviously a lot of things in buildings that can be in tension. A lot of times we talk about like carbon friendly buildings and weighing that intention. Can you give me some examples of like considerations in a facility that would involve these tensions and trade-offs?
Yeah, and I think it's going to circle around human health and well-being, because I think that's a pretty dominant topic in contemporary circles in the space. So, and I really love how you started this whole forum on like this agriculture component, because you know, we as a species kind of grew up in the wild, and that's how our brains evolved, that's how our bodies evolved, that's how a lot of our chemistry and like the neural network in our bodies, that's how it's all been designed to live within. Like we are nature, like but the rise of agriculture has been like the point at which we started separating ourselves from nature. And overly, not to overly critique the Western thought, but like we have separated and elevated mankind above nature, and our buildings have largely been an artifact of that mentality. Like, and so you go into these spaces, these built environments. This room is a great example. We have classic trees, but we don't have any windows, right? We can't really see outside. We are totally separate from most living things right now, except for those of us in the room. And so when we think about carbon, you don't even enter that conversation. You can actually, you're incentivized to lower your emissions or increase your energy efficiency. Windows are often the least performing part of any building envelope, right? And so if you're like solely focused on carbon reductions, you can minimize and like eliminate a lot of windows and have lots of spaces that aren't thoughtful with regards to how humans will be occupying them. And we know through emerging research that we perform better in a lot of variety of tasks. We heal better. We can have deeper empathy. We can cognitive tasks, we perform better when we're in spaces that are more like the nature that we as a species grew up in. And like, so that's what I'm like, so if you just focus on carbon, you miss out on lots of opportunities to think about the human experience within the space. Another kind of example I bumped up into recently, and this is more on the material side, right? And it's kind of rooted in like equity. But I've been along like, local first has been a long local sort of West Michigan tradition of thinking about local economies and trying to invest in the benefits of all these economic exchanges through the lens of like, how can we ensure the dollars invested in these investments circulate our local economy? And that has a much higher chance of being more an equitable distribution of benefit of like who benefits from these big infrastructure projects.
Definitely.
If you're only thinking about like low carbon, right, you can miss out on opportunities to invest in local tradespeople, local materials, local supply chains. Because a lot of these product labels that we help our clients with are they're national, international firms. And I was talking with the design team in South America, and they were talking about like deploying LEED, right? And like LEED has a lot of material label opportunities, right? And credits that you can pursue that are like all about EPDs and HPDs and low emitting materials. And you can get rewarded by like just focusing on the materials that are already have those labels, right? But it's a US centric rating system, it's really thinking about a US centric supply chain.
Fascinating.
And so if you over-index towards getting these points, you under-index on the local people that have been part of the ecosystem of buildings for thousands of years. And you export the dollars into more international firms. And so like the benefit is totally different. And oftentimes from a sustainability and carbon perspective, the local material is actually the lowest carbon.
Yeah.
Even though it's not maybe articulated, right? And that's where sometimes math gets in the way of like doing the right thing, because like we
Doesn't
can't
have the fancy certification.
right. We can't validate that story, but we know kind of intuitively that it's true.
Yeah.
But
that's
there's no
fascinating.
rating system that can say like, oh yeah, or like just LEED also like rewards folks for having local materials too. So like they understand the tension as a like a large
Yeah.
kind of
It's kind of a game, right? Like you study to the test, it sounds like, and
Yeah.
that often can result in unintended consequences.
yeah.
It's interesting though, when you talk about like the first example, the most efficient building sounds like the most uninspiring building, right? Like, oh, great, we have this really efficient building. If there's no windows, like, I don't want to be in there. That sounds horrible.
Yeah, I was leading a diverse team of an integrative design team for one of the first Living Building Challenge projects in Michigan back almost a decade ago now. And the energy team kind of came on and they said they had like this concrete bunker as a slide, and like, there's your net zero building. And the imagery is like, yeah, we can design things that use really low energy, but they're not humane spaces. They don't inspire anything in the human imagination. We need more of that, not less of that. So yeah, that's like a good example.
So on the energy side of things, there are a lot of trade-offs as well that we run into. And I'll just kind of run just briefly on an example of this, which is a lot of companies lately have been asking, like, I want to electrify, right? We understand that the electric grid is moving towards renewable. And natural gas, there's really not a like long-term viable option for renewable natural gas. Certainly it can be created, but no one believes it can be created to the scale that we need.
Yeah.
So people are coming to us and saying, hey, can we electrify our process or whatever it is? And so we'll look at it. And often we're finding when we run the carbon calculations, depending on what grid you operate in the country, if you operate in West Virginia or Ohio or these other places that are coal heavy, you could electrify and in fact actually emit more carbon today. Now, certainly we all know where the trend is going, which is the grid continues to get greener every year. It continues to get more cost effective with those renewable resources. But in the short term, you're actually like, again, when helping hurts, like you're trying to do the right thing. Now, obviously, like if you go look at Oregon or somewhere where there's a lot of hydropower, yeah, like let's electrify today. It's only going to get better. And there's already a compelling case. But again, like often it just takes a little bit more intentionality to take that step of like, let's dig one step deeper instead of just saying like, windows are good or windows are bad, or, efficiency is good, or like products need to have as much recycled content, or we needed to electrify, just taking that step to ask, like, how could this go wrong? Or where are we, like, where are these unintended consequences that we're running into? So, okay, so we covered the three different examples of stories, and I think we're going to land it at like, what we're trying to get at here is we need a holistic approach. You have to look at everything. And you have to understand that a building like just doesn't organically get green. And one way I think that like we told individual stories about individual things, but I actually think if we're going to get holistic, let's talk about a company that's doing things really well. And so I want to actually invite our colleague, Amy Robertson to come join us. Come right over here. So Amy, maybe just take a second to introduce yourself and say hi to everybody here. I think Logan's going to get our camera here with a good angle.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Robertson. I'm a senior client advisor here with Foresight. So happy to be here.
It's good to have you, Amy.
Thanks.
So welcome to the Nerd Fest. We're going to cover an example and one that comes up, and it's kind of like I think a Foresight favorite is a company called Interface who makes carpet tiles. And we really love the story of Ray Anderson, the CEO. So there's a book called Confessions of a Radical Industrialist. There's also a movie. What's the movie called?
Beyond Zero.
Beyond Zero. Well, anyway, instead of like us trying to piece together a story about Interface, Amy actually worked for Interface Fabric once upon a time and actually saw this at ground zero. So Amy, can you talk about, like, when we talk about a holistic approach and all the good stuff that Brad and Matt talked about, like really being inculcated in a company culture, can you tell us a little bit about the story of like Ray Anderson and Interface, the company?
Yeah, and it's really crazy looking back at all the work that was done today. and how much they accomplished and
Yeah.
continue to accomplish. But I think one of the really important things to keep in mind is that sustainability is not a program of the month
That's right.
or a department or the responsibility of one person. It really needs to be driven into the culture of the company and driven from the top. So
Well
that's
said.
where you're going to have your most success.
Got it.
But a little backstory on how Interface got their start, all the way back in '94, if you can believe this. Interface was being asked by specifiers about what they were doing for the environment.
Mhm.
And in fact, Ray was approached by a customer on the West Coast, a potential customer, that indicated from an environmental perspective, Interface didn't get it. And Ray was asking, what don't we get? We're compliant, we're legal.
Compliance, right? That's what
Yes,
matters.
exactly,
We
exactly.
hear that all the time.
Right, exactly. So Interface Research group decided to create a task force to address these questions being asked. And Ray was asked to give a speech as a kind of a kickoff meeting. Well, the problem, and talk about his environmental vision. Well, the problem was there was no vision.
Sure.
And he was really freaking out about this meeting. And ironically, about the same time, a book called The Ecology of Commerce by
Yeah.
Paul Hawken showed up on his desk. And this book really blew Ray away. In the book, Hawken indicates that the earth is in terrible danger. Oceans, air, forests, farmland, all living beings are in decline. And he called this the death of birth.
Mm.
And the culprit being industry.
Yeah.
And not just a specific industry, the entire take, make, waste,
Mm.
linear industrial situation.
Well said.
Yeah. So this was Ray's epiphany. He knew he had to change the trajectory of Interface. And this is what started Interface on its path.
Cool.
So in the early days, two programs were implemented. One, ecometrics. You mentioned we can't manage what we can't measure.
Mm.
Interface understood this from the beginning, so created ecometrics and began measuring everything. And another program called QUEST, which stands for Quality Utilizing Employee Suggestions and Teamwork. And this
Nice.
program set out to reduce waste throughout the company. And looking back, wow, Quest really gave the opportunity to empower all employees to get in on the game. And ecometrics was also part of the incentive and 401k plan.
Aha.
So
Value alignment.
value alignment, absolutely. And then in 1995, the Eco Dream Team was created. And this was a group of environmental consultants, some of the top thinkers on sustainability at the time. And it was made up of authors, activists, entrepreneurs, and scientists. So they really helped create the whole framework for Interface to move forward.
And I just want to highlight, like you said, this is in the 90s. We're not talking
Yeah.
about like 3 years ago when sustainability got hot. Like Ray was pioneering this like 2 decades before it really got cool.
Yeah, it's still fascinating to me.
Sorry, go ahead.
But I just want to share some of the success that came from ecometrics and Quest. By 2004, so still
Yeah,
a long time ago,
Yeah.
but Quest's 10th year, eliminating waste saved Interface $262 million.
Crazy.
And by 2008, it was up to 405 million.
Wild.
Yeah. And so Interface is still on that path. Today, 76% of the energy used at owned sites is renewable. 96% reduction in market-based GHG emissions at manufacturing sites. And waste sent to landfills is down 85% since 1996.
So
So
really got rid of the take, make, waste approach.
he really did.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And kudos to the whole operation. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody jumped in. So the other thing that came out of those two programs is those savings allowed them to invest in innovation.
Mm,
So just, and so I want to share some of the innovations.
let's hear
that
about
came-
it, yeah.
So in 1995, the fabric division, which I need to talk about, I'm very proud. The fabrics division launched Terratex Fabrics.
Okay.
And that was a result of working with their yarn suppliers to create a process that used recycled PET
Wild.
to
Okay.
create yarn. And then later added PLA to the Terratex family, polylactic acid, which was yarn made from cornstarch. So
Oh, cool.
very innovative.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so an LCA was actually done on Terratex way back in the day.
First LCA ever.
Yes, Brad will love that, our LCA expert. And for the 50 million pounds of recycled polyester that was used between 1996 and 2001, the amount of energy saved was equal to approximately 484,000 barrels of oil.
That's some serious impact.
So yeah, equivalent to heating 22,000 homes in the US for a year. Pretty significant. And also for 1 year, and also use 74 million less gallons of water than virgin polyester to process.
So much water savings.
So much. Another great example is in 2003, Interface sold 83 million square yards of carpet with no net global warming effect under its Cool Carpet brand.
This is in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, so far ahead of the curve.
Totally.
They also studied biomimicry and introduced some very successful products based on biomimicry. The first being Entropy, which was a carpet that really emulated the floor of a forest. So there was no matching of colors or patterns. And so there was a huge reduction in
Like waste,
material
right?
and
Yeah.
waste. Yeah. And the other product based on biomimicry was their tactiles. And these were invented in response to the nasty adhesive that was currently being used to adhere the tiles to the floor.
Got it. Yeah.
And so while studying geckos and birds, they realized that if they connect the tiles together, gravity will hold them down because they're connected. And so now instead of using adhesive, they use these 2.5 by 2.5 inch squares that connect the tiles together and no adhesive.
So then, yeah, if you have enough tiles all stuck together, like if we look at this whole floor, you wouldn't be able to move the entire carpet floor.
Correct.
Instead of adhering them to the floor, you're adhering them to each other.
Correct.
Wild.
Fascinating. Yeah. In 2012, Interface started working with 26 villages in the Philippines to collect old fishing nets and bale them and turn them into the first recycled nylon used in carpets.
Cool.
So that's pretty cool too.
Okay.
In 2000, Mission Zero was crafted to eliminate any negative impact Interface had on the environment by 2020. Showing that it's possible to create a better world and be restorative through the power of one's own influence.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. This one is really fascinating. In 2016, Interface launched their Climate Take Back program. So they're aiming to overcome the biggest challenges facing humanity and reverse global warming. But one of the pillars, which I find so fascinating because we're talking about carbon, is to love carbon. So they say it's time to stop seeing carbon as the enemy and start seeing it as a resource.
Interesting.
So they are now transitioning to raw materials that use waste carbon or sequester carbon to make their products.
That's so cool.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I think the big picture that I always take away from Interface too is like, so what I can't underline enough is like companies like Milliken that are the major competitors to Interface started decades before. And you'd think, oh, like Ray got everyone distracted and wasted a ton of resources. And that's not the truth. In fact, they grew and basically surpassed their competition through all of this. And so that's where I can't underline enough. And we're kind of going to land the plane here on a couple big pieces of what helps you do what we're talking about here. But I can't underline enough how intertwined we're finding sustainability and innovation are at an organization. I would argue companies who are unable to innovate struggle to be competitive. And I would also argue if you don't have that sustainability mindset, you don't have necessity is the mother of invention, where Ray Anderson was sitting here saying our clients want more. And so they were actually giving those clients more instead of their competitors who were like, no, this is how we've made carpet tiles since the beginning of time. We can't change. And he's not only is he innovating a whole market segment, he's gobbling up market share at the same time.
Right.
Just a fascinating story.
Fascinating. And, there were two significant recessions in the early 90s and then 2008, and they fared very well.
Well, when you don't have to spend a lot of money on utilities and waste and all the other stuff, you just run a leaner business. So
Yeah.
let's boil this down. There's been amazing themes from our subject matter experts here today, and I think we can boil it down to really the last 3 slides, which is what helps you do stuff. And so first I want to talk about like visionary leadership. I think it's really hard as an organization to have success if it doesn't come from the top. So I know, Amy, you talked about Ray Anderson a little bit, but maybe if you have any other like thoughts on like how visionary leadership is so imperative when it comes to holistically looking at sustainability.
Right. As I mentioned, you have to have buy-in from the top, but empowering your people and making them part of the process is so important. It just drives more innovation. The people on the market, on the manufacturing floor are the experts of their area. Use them, have them look for ways to reduce waste or ways to do things differently to be more efficient. So it is a holistic.
Yeah,
approach.
and you said it earlier in the webinar, and I loved it. And that is like sustainability shouldn't not ever live in the sustainability team. Like if leadership is engaging a sustainability team, they can certainly facilitate, but everyone at an organization should be bought in. And I think that involves a lot of visionary leadership. Good.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I like the visionary leadership is the person, going back to the pointillism kind of example, right? They are co-creating, let's say, the story, the vision, right? And if we don't have a really grounded in articulate vision for like who we want to be organizationally or as humans, like we're never going to get there. So like the role in my head of visionary leadership is both to like get all the things aligned, but also like have that North Star, to discover that North Star.
Absolutely.
And make sure we're trending towards that. Yeah.
So that's awesome, man. And what we're talking about, you talk about vision, and like Amy talked a lot about like engaging, people manufacturing the stuff and even all the other stakeholders. And so another component we believe you have to do to have success in looking at sustainability holistically is engaging your stakeholders. So Matt, can you talk a little bit about how we should be engaging stakeholders as an organization?
Stakeholder mapping is a little bit in the weeds, but if we want to think about like how we got to this point, like we're I think on a tail end of a market transition from like mostly shareholder economy to a mostly stakeholder economy. In my head, the easiest way I've articulated this is the shareholders are typically those who benefit, and the stakeholders are those who are impacted. And what I love about Ray Anderson's vision in the quest kind of component of this, and Toyota, you mentioned earlier, right? The cars, the manufacturers that are producing some of the best quality product in the marketplace that are more holistic. They understand who their stakeholders are, and they understand the impact, and they understand the folks that are closest to the impact typically have the best insights into solutions to overcome or minimize the impact. And that's what stakeholder mapping allows. It's like, who is impacted? How are they impacted? How can we kind of engage with them? How can we help them like into and co-create solutions together? And if you don't do the mapping, if you don't even start to thinking about like, oh, how is my product being impacted, or who is being impacted by my product from the supply chain, right? You mentioned the farmers or the fishers in the Philippines, right? Like there's impacts globally on a lot of these products, right? And so we have global stakeholders. And if we're not widening our perspective to include all the different impacts that we have as an organization, we're going to miss out on some really critical key insights.
Totally.
And in our experience, stakeholder mapping is the way of getting those insights and to collect them right into I think I'm teeing Brad here.
I love it. This is great.
Into an aligned approach.
Yeah, so that's the third piece. That's exactly right, Matt. The third piece we think that involves success is just getting everyone aligned. And so, Brad, you want to talk a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, I mean, to make noticeable change within an organization or within anything, you need everyone who's part of it going in the same direction.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right. And that's across the board. That's the people on the floor manufacturing your product. That's the people in the C-suite. It's everyone in between: engineering, human resources, accounts payable. Everyone has to buy into this vision so they can move forward together. If the C-suite decides we're no longer going to use any structural metals, we're going to replace it all with wood, but don't have the buy-in from the engineers, there's a 0% chance it's going to happen, because they're going to be butting heads like, well, we can't do it because XYZ through there. And I think that's what's great about what Ray did at Interface, was like that whole everything needed buy-in from everyone. And without that, this is a very different story.
Yeah.
You can't keep everyone siloed into their own specific little areas. You need everyone to come together and agree, this is where we're going as a company. These are our goals and how are we going to meet them together? And when you do that and everyone's on the same page, you start finding wins across the company, right?
Yeah.
All these different departments who may never talk to each other are all together, and
It connects, right?
exactly
Yeah.
just getting people in the same room who may never be in the same room, just on a brainstorming side, is going to bring up so many new ideas from like different siloed group thinks that might regularly occur.
And Brad, that's such a good point. You could make an argument that like having a combination of mapping your stakeholders and having visionary leadership who looks at the needs of the stakeholders holistically ends up resulting in aligned approach. Like that's the power of doing all these things. Like you could almost argue to what you're talking about, Brad, is this is the result, which is you have the entire organization going in the same direction, working on the same problem. Like what we saw at Interface, where again, they were the late entrance to the marketplace, but ended up becoming the market leader because they figured out visionary leadership, understanding their stakeholders internal, and getting alignment and buy-in from engineering and all the people. You know, if the marketplace says we want a more sustainable carpet tile, going to engineering and explaining how do we design that, how do we manufacture that, going to the sales team, how do we sell that, and what you get is then this aligned approach, which I think is wildly powerful. Does anybody have any other last thoughts? Otherwise, just a reminder, we're going to jump into Q&A here in just 1 minute. So if you have any questions for our slate of experts here, just type them right in the chat and we'll address those in a second. But is there any, Matt, Brad, Amy, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I had just one more comment, you know, on eliminating waste, and we were talking about east-west theories. Eliminating waste is really tied to lean manufacturing processes, which is the Toyota way.
Yeah.
So that's just another comment.
I love it.
Yeah.
I think I'm good. I'm ready for questions.
Yeah, I guess we'll like we covered this a lot, but I'll just land the plane on saying what we talked about today is, I would argue, relatively simple, but it is not easy. And that's okay. You know, I think we can all name that. Like there's magical people like Ray Anderson and other, and again, this Interface isn't the only company that figured this out, but there are those organizations that figured it out. And so we just want to name like this takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of, like, you look at like even just day to day, like what Matt and Brad do, like it takes a lot of intention and thoughtfulness to really weigh, like we have a lot of constraints, we have a lot of decisions, we have a lot of stakeholders, and like holding those all in tension is we're not acting like this is an easy process. But I would argue if you can invest in it and you can get buy-in across your organization, it can really like innovate and change your business for the better.
Yeah, I think the point about it not being easy is really important to make, because it's hard. And it was really hard for me not to swear just then, because I swear a lot, but it's really hard. And you know, the visionary leader can have the best vision, but unless there's like engagement and authentic kind of communication and collaboration, you won't get the buy-in. You won't get all the things. And that's really the messy, hard work, is the interpersonal way of like dealing with different humans and different perspectives, right? You know, in a perfect world, we may be perfectly aligned with what we think is the right thing for the future, but we're not.
Sure.
And that's I think one of the at Foresight, what we encounter with more often than not is just the messiness of like humans doing good work together.
Yeah.
Not just internal, but external to our clients and partners as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Well, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. Carolyn, I think you're sending those to Matt or
Yeah.
me?
Yep.
If you want to host this up here on the questions, Matt.
Yeah, I am going to skip in the middle because I really like this question, and it's for you, Brad. The question is, can you predict the impact of a product before you make it, rather than measuring the carbon impact after? What tools would you use for that?
Yeah, so there are a lot of resources out there that do help you quantify the cradle to gate energy of a material. There is a free resource we use. I think we actually touched on it in our last month's webinar about actual carbon of products. Is the University of Bath's ICE database, which is a publicly available data that lists out different materials and how they're processed. So even if it's steel, it's going to look at if it's cast, if it's rolled, and it gives the relative or the world average, because obviously it's going to be very different based on the materials that go in it, and give you a kilogram of carbon per kilogram of that material you're using. So there are other kind of rules of thumb. Obviously, if you think Metals are going to be the most carbon impactful because you have to melt them down and cast them. There's all the cooling and everything. Plastics are actually, not surprisingly, also pretty carbon intensive. And then if you're looking more at the bio-based materials, you can actually have negative embodied carbon because they're actually, as Amy mentioned earlier, they're sequestering the carbon as they're growing, and that the carbon reduced actually outweighs the carbon emitted during the processing of them. So,
Cool.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna touch on like LCAs can be a
Yes.
useful tool as well. So Brad talked about some of the free stuff, but we're finding companies all the time are coming to us, and I'm dragging Brad on calls for sales. And they're saying, hey, we want to maybe iterate on the next design of our product, and we're looking at different materials or different approaches or different manufacturing. And we can actually model all that out in a life cycle assessment and demonstrate. We have clients where they've completely innovated on a manufacturing process, and they say, help us quantify this and help us make our manufacturing process better. And we found what, Brad, like 90% reductions in, eutrophication and carbon emissions by taking a different, innovative, different approach to
Yes.
manufacturing.
exactly, yeah, and that's like we keep saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. That's the measurement of your product, right?
Yeah.
Doing a full study, looking the entire carbon, the eutrophication, as Mike said, acidification,
Yeah.
water usage, which we don't look at a lot because we're in a very water area with a lot of fresh water. But if you go to California, Arizona, and you're manufacturing there, fresh water usage is probably a bigger deal than some of the other impact categories you can look at.
Well said.
Yeah, and I really love this idea too of we often get asked to look at like simple small tweaks that have like the biggest impact, and Brad can map those inputs and outputs and find those wins. But we're also finding the next kind of like the frontier of this is actually from a design side,
Yes.
designing carbon
Yes.
out from the beginning.
Mhm.
And there are tools then also, like this it's relatively the same tools. Like if we did this product as a structure, steel versus wood, to use your reference example earlier, we can articulate what the carbon saved is from that decision.
Cool.
And help that be as part of the design, like inform the design process. And by the way, we're talking about carbon or product specific examples, like buildings also. The same is true. Buildings, we think about carbon largely through the built environment, through scope 1 and 2, which is like natural gas and electricity consumption. But the built materials themselves are like when you build a building, the first time you build it, you assemble all those materials. They're equal to about 40 years worth of burning of the natural gas and consuming electricity. So it's a huge impact. And yes, we can map those out for you and help you understand to like cost and carbon optimize the material choices of your building.
Building LCA,
Right.
it's cool stuff.
Yeah.
So there's lots of tools to help predict the impact of future decisions or decisions now into the future.
Yeah, and I think what I really like what you touched on there, Matt, is that these tools should be used in design process.
Yeah.
They were developed and intended to be used in a design process.
Yeah.
We're at the point now where they've become kind of reactively being used. If I have my product, people are asking about the carbon, can I have a number for it? Which it's a use for it, but you're not being proactive on your product. You can do an LCA on a product that doesn't exist, that is just in somebody's brain right now, right? If they can give us a bill of materials and what the building might look like or the table might look like, we can help you design a lower impactful product based on that. And that's where these really should be. If you want to get the most out of these tools and the most out of your design processes, this is where it needs to be implemented.
Really cool.
Yeah, and I'll also say to that point, these tools live on a spectrum. These impacts live on a spectrum, right? There's obvious choices that you can make, like from the structural, using the same example, right? We know wood is a less embodied carbon than steel. So you can make that choice as a designer and have confidence that you're having a positive impact on the carbon story. But you don't probably know how much, right? But once you made that decision, and if you still have a ways to go, right? There's difference in species and where you're sourcing those things from, and that like granularity is really, I think, where the magic of some of these evaluation tools are, because you have to like you can't just rely on the easy obvious things. You have to get really detailed, really in the weeds, and that's also kind of the next frontier, because we've And we've been at the sustainability thing interface for 30 years, but most of us for 10 or 15, right? So we've already done all the easy wins. We've replaced all the old efficient lights with LEDs, right? What's next is like the minutia of all these systems and their interactions as a whole composite, which is where these evaluation tools really kind of come in and have value.
Well said.
All right, we asked one question, so now we're going to look at the next one. Let's pick this one. So rather than start with a one-off project in a department, where should we start? Anybody can answer that.
Road mapping, materiality, figuring out what's important to your organization.
Asking stakeholders. Yeah, if you don't involve all your stakeholders, you'll find you've started on a journey, but you haven't laid out your map. So I totally agree, Amy, like understanding what's important to who and why. What we're finding, especially now with our clients in the furniture supply chain and the automotive supply chain, is OEMs have a lot of expectations. And so if those are your customers, I would argue they're a very important stakeholder, just one of many, but still an important stakeholder. So I couldn't agree more. Like understanding your stakeholders and what they care about and what's valuable is a huge place to start. And then you'll quickly find, oh, if all of our customers really care about us, I'll make it up, responding to the CDP, we should probably figure out how to respond to it and make sure that we're scoring what they're expecting.
Yeah, for me, figuring out what's important. I mean, the material studies, which if you don't know, it's a really weird word to use. What's important to you is a materiality study. Which isn't obvious to people like me.
Weird.
No, because in architecture we use materiality for a totally different.
Like what are the materials in the building?
Yeah.
No, they're saying like what is material, but yeah, it's a GRI thing. And
But where I was going with that is like it's the vision.
Yeah.
What's your vision? What's your story? I've been in so many sessions and spaces through the lens of like the built environment, architecture and design recently, and it's all rooted in storytelling. Like I think the first step is like what story do you want to tell about your company, about your product, about your work, about how you engage, right? Like, what's the story? And it can't be 6 stories. It's a singular story. And then you can start on the points, right? Because a lot of us oftentimes just like going back to the pointillism example, we just start really immediately on like, what's the project? Like, what's the point? What's the dot on the page? What's the first thing without doing the first framing, the composition? What's the story? What's the imagery you want to share?
Great.
And then from there, everything else can kind of fall in line with all the other work that has to happen,
Right.
But you have to have Ray Anderson, like a regenerative carpet manufacturing company, right? Like that's a vision, right? And he didn't say like, oh, we just need to reduce our carbon story of our carpet by 20%. Like that wasn't the thing he started with. He had the vision. He set the vision, and I think all the other work out of that is kind of like the next step, but it's really critical to get what your story is.
Yeah, it helps you become proactive instead of reactive.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well said.
Is there a direct relationship between impact and risk for a company? Once we focus on impact, we also better understand risk and opportunities. Like that's kind of a statement and also a question, but like, can we maybe just talk about the relationship? Because we've talked a lot about impact, right? But like risk is another sort of other end of that flip side of that coin, which is it can and it can't be though.
Like we're finding a lot of our clients are having impact by reducing their energy consumption, which ultimately reduces their carbon footprint. And a risk reduction is utility prices are viciously variable. We saw last year in the open markets, natural gas went 3 times higher. It started the year around $3 and it was up over $9 for a while. And so I would argue if you have the impact of figuring out how to reduce your natural gas consumption in your manufacturing process, you've actually de-risked the cost. We had a lot of manufacturing companies last year talk about millions of dollars of unbudgeted energy costs that ate into their profits. And so I would argue, yes, sometimes they can be in tension, but in other cases, if you have costs, whether that's air permitting, compliance costs, utility costs, et cetera, if you can design some of that out of your process, you've actually de-risked the need to make sure that you're in compliance with your air permit, or make sure that you're buying enough utilities. And I get that goes the other way too, right? If you really want to source, I'll make it up like a post-consumer or post-industrial material, and Brad can explain this more, like you better hope that that company still has that in the future, because if you don't, that is a real risk and sustainability. So I don't want to act like it's all roses and sunshine, but it doesn't always have to be intention.
Yep.
Next question. What types of strategies and services does Foresight offer to help companies approach sustainability more holistically? I like this question.
Road mapping.
Explain what a road mapping exercise is, Amy.
Yeah, so basically interviewing multiple people within your organization to, again, create a strategy, create a map that you can use every day to reach your goals.
Yeah, the other thing that we've been really starting to innovate on, and it lives kind of in between Brad and Matt's teams, is like understanding product design and manufacturing. I think often our clients. Go ahead.
Buildings.
Then buildings, sorry, manufacturing in the buildings. So what we find is our companies come to us and they say, either we want to design something better, dear Brad and your team, help us do that, or we want to have a better building or a more efficient manufacturing process, dear Matt and your team, help us do an energy audit or whatever. We're starting to get companies who are finally asking us holistically, can we look at like what we're making and how it's designed, and then as we understand that, how it's actually being manufactured, and look at the whole thing holistically. So that can involve things like a decarbonization strategy. So the road mapping is great to understand stakeholders, and that's a good first step. Some of our clients are more sophisticated, and so it's literally like a whole decarbonization journey. And a lot of that stuff, frankly, is custom. Like that's the joy of Foresight. We're like big enough that we have really smart people, but we're small enough that it's not like, hey, you have to buy this one thing that's our product, or too bad. And I think we've gotten really creative with some of our clients on doing that.
And I think what you're saying with Matt and I, where we focus in on is on the more on the environmental impact. I know Matt touches more on the some of the wellness pieces, but this really doesn't touch a lot of the social impacts. And that's where something like road mapping or materiality, like if that's something that as a company you want to be a leader in your community for your workers and what they're exposed to and what they're working on every day, and the community around you, that's something that would come out in that stakeholder engagement of talking with them of what's important for you as a company.
Yeah, and I think my response to this question isn't really like, what's the one service we have?
Yeah.
It's actually, what are all the services that we offer?
Oh, Matt, let's go. Come on.
What I think, when I think about the team here at Foresight, what I love so much is like, we're such a diverse, and we have such wide spectrums of expertise. We have chemical kind of experts and chemical engineers, but we also have design thinkers that think in abstracts and have facilitating expertise to help wrangle a bunch of egos in a room to have a shared vision, right? And so while and also, by the way, we're a value-centric organization, right? We lead with our values. Like we have them on the wall. Every decision we make is kind of filtered through those values. And so we kind of like that practice of like being driven and approaching all of our work through those values, through our story that we want to tell to the universe. It gives us real kind of lived experience in helping coach and mentor and encourage our clients to do the same. So yes, it's important to have that road mapping, that storytelling component, but then we can also have deep experts in such a wide spectrum of disciplines to help you in just about every step of the way, right? And you're not going to get that, I don't think, anywhere else. And that's not hyperbolic. I think we've done competitive analysis, and like, yeah, we have competitors in some spaces, but not others, right? So like the whole service offering that we have as a company, I think is really like
rooted in this vision.
Yeah.
Good. Hey, I want to name, we're at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
So for those of you who need to hop off, thank you for attending. We're so grateful that you're here. Just want to highlight, do we have a slide on the next webinar for next month? We will be doing a webinar next month with Floyd, Wendy, and Danny. That'll be a sustainability road mapping for beginners.
Hey,
Who knew? I
Great,
didn't even
yeah.
know.
Let's go, Amy. You like did the pitch. That'll be Thursday, the 27th at 10 a.m. So for all of you who joined us, thanks. We're also going to continue and stay on. We want to make sure we answer all of the questions. So if you want to hang around and listen to the responses, that's great. If you need to hop off, again, this is recorded. We'll send you some more information, but thank you so much for attending.
yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Matt. What
So
question?
it looks like we have three more, and I want to start with this one. So for people who work at companies that don't have sustainability initiatives, how can people start their company down the road to sustainability?
I'll start on this. I love this question. We find that there are still a lot of organizations who think about sustainability in a political frame, and it's just not a great framework to think about sustainability. And so what I've always found is if you ask a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, basically anybody anywhere who wants to give more money to their utility company on their energy bills, I've never met a person who says, yeah, I just can't. I wake up and I just think about how much money I can give the utility companies. Like nobody says that. And so I would argue instead of like, I think Matt, you talked about this earlier, like we've gotten in this weird, like polarized society and like see each other as enemies instead of all like a collective. It's our country. We all live here. We should want to make this a better place. And so I just find if you focus on things like, hey, we want to eliminate waste. Again, I don't know many people who would be like, I disagree with that. So often I find framing things in a way where you can get broad buy-in is a really good way to start. And that's frankly, like a lot of our clients aren't all that excited about sustainability. And that's great. Like we talked about, we're a vision and values oriented company. And our mission is three things. It's accelerate sustainability. A lot of people buy into that. Increase profitability. Basically everybody's into that. And then champion energy management. Other people are into that. And so some of our clients love all three. Some of our clients like one or two of them. And so we've just found like we're a big tent organization. We all live here in this community. I think no one would disagree that we want cleaner air to breathe, better water, less expenditures on overhead things like utility. So I don't know, that's how I would frame it if I was at an organization, is like, instead of coming out and saying sustainability, I would just say like, maybe we could like be more efficient, waste less, and might find more buy-in. I don't know, is anybody else have any thoughts?
I love that.
Yeah, I think I have a quick story here that I like telling because it gets at like the potential power of grassroots organization.
Yeah.
But I also want to layer in the power of story.
Yeah.
Data does not change behavior. Largely, if it did, we wouldn't be in this mess, by the way. It's really the story we tell about that data, right? And the stories we tell about our organization are rooted in our values, right? And so my encouragement is always to like not treat and talk and try to pitch sustainability as this other thing that we need to do, but it's the way. If you say you love this, like if this is your value, there's a little bit of homework to do, but you can like tell a convincing story, not even using the word sustainability, but like if we say we care about our humans, this is all the things we should be doing in that space to make sure that that message, that value is really authentic in how we show up in the world. And like that is a really compelling story and way of kind of pitching and building support for this. So David Orr, I mean, this story he was at Oberlin College in the early 1990s, late 1990s, and he was building a new building for his kind of environmental program.
Yeah.
And administration were like, this is too expensive. This is all the things like we don't get this. But what he did is he actually engaged with his students, which are essentially his stakeholders, the university stakeholders, the people that are actually most impacted by the buildings that they choose to build and how they choose to build them, because they spend most of their academic careers in these buildings, and just kind of like asked those students for how they think. And then he like brought all those students with opinions to the offices of the administrators and be like, here's somebody else's perspective. And the overwhelming student buy that was in support was the thing that tipped the needle. Like, and it's storytelling.
Yeah.
It's finding those stakeholders. It's finding the story and then like telling that story, like just truth to power, essentially, right? It's like, and I just love that. So it's like, find the story, find the values, connect it to a sustainability initiative that you care about, find other people in your stakeholder web that are similarly minded, and then show up in force with a story that is aligned with the values of the organization.
It's great.
Love it.
Love that.
For manufacturing companies with heavy operations, how much does it matter to look at the manufacturing building? That feels like me. I didn't realize that until I got
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Brad too, I think.
Yeah, I think
it's all of us. And we talked about like the intersections of the products that we're manufacturing, the building we're doing that work in, and the organizational that is doing all those things, right? And there's like these sweet spots. And manufacturing has a lot of energy, right? In architectural circles, we say buildings consume 40% of, well, they consume 70% of US electric, they contribute 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And we talk about through the lens of like civic buildings and in these kind of like one-off buildings that are like really, they're good examples of like carbon free or like a sustainability story, but really a lot of that wedge, that 40% comes from industry and buildings that industry happens within. And so for me in this space, it was really like, oh yeah, we need to talk about industry because that's the biggest area of impact in that 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions associated with buildings. And there's lots of synergies in how we produce products and how we heat and condition our buildings, right? And like waste heat as an example, right? Some facilities have heat intensive processes in really hot climates. And so they're just spending a ton of money on air conditioning to make the space comfortable, or they're just churning through talent because they're like oppressively hot in the floor, right? And so like there's ways to think about that and get into like synergies of how to solve that. But it's again, it's a holistic approach.
Was the question around the manufacturing equipment or the building shell?
I think both. Yeah, and I
Does it
think
matter to look at the manufacturing building? So I think the question is really like, if we have a carbon reduction and we have a really intensive manufacturing process,
Does the building matter?
does the building matter?
Yeah, and the short answer is it absolutely does. Because I think often we think about these like grand, all of a sudden we made it. And I think if you learn from Interface and you learn from most companies, sustainability is a journey. And it's a very incremental approach. So incrementalism is like getting 1% better every day. And you look back 5 years from now and you're in a really good spot. And so, yeah, you're right. Like if you're a foundry, 90% of your energy or whatever is going into melting metal and the only other 10% is going into everything else. It's still 10% though.
Yeah.
And that 10% can be squeezed and better managed. So I would argue the answer is yes. If you really want to decarbonize and get more efficient, you should have all options on the table and take a strategic approach of understanding like what can we do in our process, what can we do in our building, what gives us the best financial return and the best return for the stakeholders. Like you mentioned, there may be other considerations like we updated our lighting, which didn't save us a whole lot of money, but it's brighter and our employees are happier and there's less safety issues because people can see where they're going. So yeah, I would argue just because you have an intense process doesn't mean you should overlook your facility.
Yeah.
Right. Depending on how your manufacturing is set up, you might be able to create a more efficient manufacturing process.
And that's kind of what we always that's the easiest thing for you to change if you're looking at the carbon or the impacts of your products, right? Is control what you have control over, right? And if it's in your facility, you should 100% have control of what's happening in there, right? So can you change your processes? Can you find any innovative ways? Are you scrapping 40% of the material that comes through your door, right?
Not very
Manufacturing
sustainable.
process.
Can you clean that up, right? What do you have direct control over in your facility and work through that? That if you are that, if back to the foundry piece where upstream's not a ton, you are the big piece of it.
Yeah.
You have a bigger window now that you have control over that you can play with to lower that total impact.
It goes into wellness too, because acoustics and manufacturing is becoming huge. If people are happy in their environment, they're gonna.
Yeah, they're more productive. They stay around longer. You don't turn over and it's
Make fewer mistakes,
Yes, totally.
have less waste. Yeah, there's so many design elements to a lot of what Brad was just saying too about the circularity and like the recyclability of like what products are coming off that supply chain too, right? So it just takes a really thoughtful, integrated approach. And I'll also say this is kind of coming up in a recent example of a client we're working with now. Buildings are placed on a piece of property, right? And a lot of times these organizations, these manufacturers, like have a lot of adjacent land that the building's built on, largely parking lots, but we can talk about that at another time. But if you just plant turf grass, because it's easy, right? You're missing an opportunity to like really think about the whole ecosystem of the site, the property that you manage and are steward of. Right. And so the building isn't the only story. The manufacturing process isn't the only story. Land management is also part of this story. And I think there's actually tremendous opportunity to think about all the different kind of like layers of like there's a roof layer, right? There's a ground plane, like there's lots of different ways to think about carbon and carbon sequestration in ecosystems and ecosystem health and water, wastewater, all these things, not just through like the lens of like a manufacturing process or building, but the whole kind of site ecosystem.
Yeah.
That's really kind of interesting.
So,
I just want to I think this question was a great example of value alignment.
Yeah.
Because I think all four of us heard the same words and thought of very different things.
That's a really.
Yeah.
great-
So
it's bad.
that's like, you're gonna get 4 different answers from 4 different people based on that,
Beautiful.
because
Totally
yeah.
beautiful.
Love
And
that.
the benefit of having diverse stakeholders in the room.
Exactly, yep, yeah.
Totally.
Because if you only have 2 of us, you get a really limited, you get
I-
half the perspective in the room.
I think that was one of the best questions we've had asked because of what it came through, yeah.
Oh, Brad, come on.
Last one, thank you all for staying with us, and thank you too, viewer, if you are still there. How are LCAs incorporated into design when you don't know anything about the end product? Do you always have to have a bill of materials or construction documents?
So I think an LCA is very, it has kind of gotten a definition or a picture of being a full end product of something. But really what an LCA is you're looking at the environmental impact of different stages of a life cycle. So I could do an LCA just to the first gate of the manufacturer, right? Just the materials that you're sourcing. It's still an LCA, it's still within the bounds of everything. And you don't need to have the idea of the final product down there. If you even just have an idea of ratios of what that material might look like. I'm thinking of a product that's going to be 60% wood, 20% aluminum, 10% steel. The remainder is going to be plastic, fillers, small things like that, right? At least then we can kind of look at what those impacts might look like and then say, well, here, like, if this is what you want, here's your total impact for these categories. And it, like, your aluminum may still be your largest impact there. So are there alternatives? What you're thinking you're going to use aluminum for, if it is like some supports in it, well, can you swap it out for maybe a recycled feed somewhere else? Can you swap it with wood and look through it? And what it will also do is, since it gives you ideas of the total impact each material has, you can use that as a risk, in a risk study as well of, well, if that's going to cost me $100,000 to make that change, if I have to change aluminum suppliers, but I can do my plastic thing and remove all that plastic, remove my 10%, and that's only going to cost me $5,000, right? So, or whatever that might look like. So it gives you the relative impact of materials and design choices you have that you can then use and weight against what the actual cost might look like to make those design decisions. So I really like to dispel the idea that an LCA is a final stamp kind of thing, because it's used for that. But there's so many more possibilities that you can use. Even if you're just changing, if you put in LED lights, we can run that. We can run a study of what's the total impact of that one decision you've done.
Yeah.
Right. That may look over the entire piece of the entire life of the product, but it doesn't have to. We can give you over just your gate to gate over the entire product life, whatever that looks like. Is all an LCA is. It's a modeling tool for you to quantify the environmental impacts of design choices.
Well, so you can use it to create your toolbox from which you
Exactly.
design all your.
Yes.
products.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's
Yeah.
hard because I think what you've named is true, and that is almost all the LCAs in wide circulation are completed LCAs.
Yes.
They're published, they've been third-party verified, they've gone through all the rigor and people are using them. But what you don't see is upstream, for every one of those, there could be hundreds of LCAs that were done to tweak designs and
Yeah.
do stuff. They never see the light of day outside of the organization. They're simply meant
Yeah.
to use as design. So don't think, like, I know maybe many of you may have interacted with LCAs and seen those finished product ones, but yeah, it's common for us to make ones that never get published
Yeah.
outside of.
And Matt's team works with full building LCAs, which almost exclusively uses commodity level LCAs. So it is structural steel to that, and it's a generic material, but there's still environmental impact data around all these commodity levels: steel, concrete, wood, plasterboard, everything in the that's where the big where this push came from, is from the building environment.
Yeah.
Cool.
I like to say that, and it's not me, there's lots of studies, and Joe Rahm is the guy that's largely quoted with this, but he pulled it from lots of different studies. But he says, when you've just spent before you spent 1% on your product's first cost, right? And that's most design. That's the early sort of conceptualization of a building or a product. You've committed about 70 to 80% of its carbon impacts. And so I would argue actually the LCA tool is best,
Yes.
most valuable, most
Yes.
impactful in the early design stages.
Yes.
But there are, we use different, we make different assumptions. We tailor the modeling process. So it's not like this cumbersome, all-inclusive exercise. We're just trying to test certain parameters in the concepting of the product or building. And we have all these tools at our disposal, like LCAs, yes, from an embodied carbon perspective, but also energy modeling, right?
Mhm.
Early phase energy modeling from a building perspective is in the same space. But we just use those tools differently. We use actually different tools as well, that are a little bit lighter on the building side than like a whole like compliance-based energy model as an example. But to Brad's point, like we can test a lot of different things, and in the concept space, it stays pretty high level. But as you kind of get into like, oh, this is the thing, here's the concept, and we're landing the plane on what the actual design is, we can really dial in the specificity of which we're testing and how we're like, yeah, we could start with a generic EPD of a structural steel component, but by the end, we're like testing 20 different suppliers of that same product to find the right one in the right location, the right sourcing that will optimize and cost is also almost always a concern, right? So all these different manufacturing, these sourcing locations have different costs. And so we can really like, oh, this is the lowest carbon with the highest cost. Here's like a slightly less carbon intensive product, but a much lower price point. So maybe that's the trade-off we're making, and that's the optimized solution. And we get more granular, more detailed as the concept evolves. But oh my goodness, I can't say this more like enough. Like, yes, these tools can be used in that concept design space. In fact, that's their most valuable kind of
well said.
execution. Like that's where they have the most value.
Yeah.
And it's also like collaboration, the soft, messy human skills that's really critical in that, because we often think we don't have enough time. We don't have the expertise. Well, collaboration, partnerships, that's how we kind of solve for that and build trust, and we like build a language of like working together in that really fast, messy first phases. But there's ways to do it. You just got to have to want to.
Yeah, and any type of physical modeling, whether it's energy modeling, LCAs, any kind of like physical, where you're trying to model a physical system, the earlier you can get that model up as a proof of concept in that design piece, the more value that has. Because it's much easier to shift it when you're in a rowboat than you are once the cruise ship is out.
I love it. Let's end on that. Thank you so much for joining us on sustainability, tensions, and trade-offs. What a wild conversation. It went all over the place, and that's how we like it. Amy, thanks for joining us. Matt, Brad, thanks for joining us. For all of you who stuck it out here to the end, we're grateful that you were here, and we'll look forward to doing our forum next month. We'll talk to you then.
All right.